Welcome back. Today we're talking about why what you think is normal isn't. You know, I recently reconnected with some old friends I've fallen out of touch with. And after catching up, I've spent a lot of time over the last few weeks thinking about the stories we tell ourselves, the narratives we build about how the world works, about what's typical, normal, about what we should expect from life. And I think most of us carry this really comforting story with us. It goes something like this. If you work hard, if you're sensible with your choices, if you plan things out reasonably well, you'll end up somewhere predictable, somewhere safe. We imagine life arranged along this neat curve you've likely seen hundreds of times. Most of us clustered in the middle, few people doing exceptionally well up there, and a few struggling down here. It feels fair, doesn't it? It feels like the way things ought to be. But here's the thing I keep coming back to. The world doesn't actually arrange itself that way. Not really. Reality is lopsided. It's full of these strange asymmetries, these odd patterns, these probabilities that bend in ways that our intuition just can't quite grasp. And once you start noticing where those curves actually go, once you begin to see the shape of things as they really are, rather than how we think they should be, something shifts. Your choices start to look different. How you approach challenges and successes evolves. Your life starts to look different as well. So today I want to walk through 5 of these distortions with you. 5 places where what we think is normal really isn't. And maybe if we can see these patterns more clearly, we can navigate them a bit more wisely. Imagine this. A couple buys a house they can afford on 2 salaries, thinking they're being careful. Then, one layoff later, they're losing everything. It's just what people do now, isn't it? Both partners work. It's sensible. It's practical. It feels like you're building a buffer against uncertainty. If one job disappears suddenly, at least there's the other one to fall back on. This makes sense because instead of just having one source of income, you now have 2. But when you actually look at how risk works, something strange emerges. 2 independent risks don't cancel each other out. They multiply. An example here might help. Here's what I mean. Let's say each person has a 5% chance of losing their job in any given year. Your intuition might tell you that with 2 incomes, you've halved your household risk. But that's not how probabilities work. The actual risk that one of them will lose their job in any given year is about 10%, or 1 in 10. You've nearly doubled your exposure to disruption, not halved it. And here's the really insidious part. When both people in a household are working, the lifestyle tends to inflate to match. Economists have a fancy term for it, lifestyle creep. Even if you're prudent and save more than before, the mortgage assumes more than one salary. The 2 car payments affordable only with both salaries. The childcare costs only make sense when both people are earning their full share. You've built this machine that requires both engines running at full capacity all the time, with no slack, no margin for error. Yes, there's secondary income to fall back on temporarily, but if your fixed costs require both incomes, you're not more resilient. You're twice as exposed to financial catastrophe. The same pattern shows up in all the places we think we're building safety through redundancy. We pack our schedules to 100% capacity thinking we're being efficient. Then one delayed train, one 20-minute traffic jam, and the entire day collapses. We optimize every single minute with fancy block schedules, eliminate every gap, and end up with systems so brittle they shatter at the first disruption. Nature doesn't work that way. Rivers meander, forests hold clearings. The most resilient systems deliberately waste a little energy. The slack is what keeps them alive when conditions change. The real stability doesn't come from having more streams of income or filling every waking hour. It comes from needing less, from allowing gaps in space, living deliberately below what the world insists is normal, so that when disruption comes, and it always comes eventually, you can absorb the shock rather than shatter under it. Here's a true story. Bill Gates walks into a dive bar and suddenly everyone in the room is a millionaire, on average. Economists are absolutely obsessed with averages, aren't they? GDP of a whole country of 360 million, the average income, the average lifespan, the average level of happiness, the average market returns over 123 years. These numbers sound so clean and so objective, like they're telling us something true about the typical human experience. But averages lie, not intentionally, but tacitly. In most of the areas that actually matter, wealth, health, longevity, creative success, well-being, education, the shape doesn't look like a gentle hill with most people in the middle. It looks like a cliff. A few extreme outliers stretch the data so violently that the average lands in this place where almost nobody actually exists. I promise this will make sense. Let me give you a concrete example. Imagine 10 people in a room. 9 of them earn $40,000 a year. 1 of them earns $10 million. The average income in that room is over $1 million. That number is mathematically correct, but it describes exactly 0 of those people's actual lives. That's where the median becomes crucial. The median income in that room is still $40,000. The actual middle point where half earn more and half earn less. That's the number that describes the typical experience. If we look at the US, where the median household wealth is around $200,000, but the mean, the average, is a hair over $1 million. Think about what that gap tells you. The shape is pulled so far by extreme outliers that the average is almost 5 times the typical experience. The top 10% of households hold 67% of all the wealth. The bottom 50% hold about 5%, and with some estimates that put it at about 2.5%. I think about this a lot in creative work. When you look at the average success of musicians or actors, it looks pretty good, right? But that's because a tiny handful of outliers, the Taylor Swifts, the Tom Hanks, they pull the average up into this completely unrealistic place. The actual curve would show us that most performers cluster down here, working steadily, playing small venues, taking supporting roles, or teaching acting classes, making a modest living doing work they care about and that they enjoy, but that never goes platinum or wins Oscars. And here's the thing about splitting any group. You divide people into, let's say, more educated and less, or average of higher degrees earned, and you expect 2 bell curves. Instead, you find 2 separate worlds with hardly anyone in between. The middle class isn't a bulge in the middle. It's often a gap with people clustered at either end. Once you see the real shape, the way it actually bends, the world doesn't suddenly become fair, but it becomes knowable. You stop asking, why am I not average? Because the average is a statistical ghost. It doesn't describe anyone's actual experience. Understanding where you actually sit in the landscape, that's what matters. And honestly, there's a strange kind of peace in that clarity. And from that grounded understanding, you actually have a sensible chance to plot your course. Let's say when picking a fund for your work retirement investment, you ignore a 1% management fee because it seems tiny. 30 years later, it ate away 1/3 of your retirement savings. A 1% difference sounds trivial, doesn't it? Barely worth paying attention to. Whether it's a 1% fee on an investment or a 1% daily improvement in a skill, it just doesn't feel significant in the moment. To let 1% slide, it's practically imperceptible. We wouldn't even catch it happening. Our intuition treats small numbers as small, but the compounding doesn't care about intuition. Not even a little bit. Maybe an example will help. Say the market returns 10% annually, an easy number. With just that, 10,000 becomes 67,000 over 20 years. But with a 1% annual fee, so you're netting 9% instead of 10, that same investment only reaches 56,000. That tiny 1% fee costs you 11,000, which is about 17% of what you could have had. Over 40 years, typical career span, that 1% fee takes 32% of your retirement nest egg. This is because just like your returns compound, that 1% fee compounds as well. And here's the thing, most advisory fees don't actually generate returns that justify their cost. Study after study show that actively managed funds after fees underperform passive index funds. So you're not paying 1% to get better returns. You're paying 1% to get worse returns. All this means is to justify a 1% fee, the advisor would need to outperform the market by more than 1% consistently, year after year, for decades. And that's exceedingly rare. Yes, there are folks who can do it, on average. But we only know who they are after the fact, never before. And that's not because of some dramatic moment, a black swan event, but because the math is completely indifferent to fairness. It just is. Excellent news is that the same force works in the opposite direction also. A 1% daily improvement, and I mean truly tiny improvement, barely noticeable in the moment, compounds to making you 6 times better in 6 months, and 37 times better over the course of just a single year. The payoff is all at the end, which is why so few of us persist in the face of lack of visible progress. Which is something I remind myself all the time whenever I start developing a particular skill seriously. I don't have to wait for some breakthrough moment. I just commit to practicing every single day, even if only for 10 minutes. Most days, really all days, nothing remarkable happens. But over months, over years, those tiny, consistent sessions compound into something I never could have predicted. Am I 37 times better? Of course not. I've let that 1% slide more days than I'd like to admit. But the difference consistency makes can't be ignored. We intuitively get it when it comes to, say, working out every other day like clockwork, instead of once a month. But forget that this applies across the board to all areas of life. In health, in relationships, in money, in creative work. The math of repetition always wins. Small actions are never really small. They're just slow enough to be invisible until they've already reshaped the entire landscape beneath your feet. When you truly internalize this, when you start noticing these hidden compounds running silently in the background of your life, the world stops feeling quite so random. It starts feeling like something you can understand, something you can carefully and patiently learn to work with. I recently read an article by an economist, and he said that their models say that the 2008 style crash should happen about every once 10,000 years. And we've had 3 of them in the last century. In a classical bell curve, that shape we're coming back to, extreme events are incredibly rare. You're talking about things that happen once in millions or billions of occurrences. 3 standard deviations out, the term is not important. And you've basically left the realm of realistic possibility. It's very elegant, it's simple to explain in a high school class. But most of the important things in life don't follow that pattern at all. They follow what actuaries call power laws, where extreme events happen far more often than our intuition expects. The entire premise of all kinds of insurance is rooted in this. The financial markets are a perfect example. If stock market returns followed a bell curve, we would see a crash like the 2008 was, maybe once every few thousand years. But we've seen multiple crashes of that magnitude in just the last century. The extreme events happen way more often than the tidy models predict. And given the recent history, the same is true for pandemics, for technological disruption, for career success, for the impact of individual books or albums on our ideas. The extreme outcomes, both good and bad, happen way more often than the pragmatic bell curve would suggest. And here's why this matters. We build our lives, our institutions, our plans, as if we're living in a world of predictable averages. We assume extreme events are vanishingly rare. Few experts call attention to this, so we don't prepare for them. We optimize for the typical case. And then an outlier event happens. A financial crisis, a pandemic, a sudden tech invention wipes out an entire industry, like taxi drivers. and we're caught completely off guard saying nobody could have predicted this. But that's not quite true. The pattern predicted it. We just weren't looking. And here's another place this shows up, and where most of us, myself included, go astray. Thing is, we're actually quite good at assessing individual risks, but we're terrible at understanding how risks combine. Let's say you take on 3 separate things, each with a 5% chance of going wrong, and you think your risk is something like way less than 1%. And that's true, 1 in 8,000 for all 3 to happen at once. But the chance that at least one of them happens is closer to 14%, or about 1 in 7. Our intuition just eyeballs them up, but that's not how probability works. If your assumption is 1 in 8,000 and the reality is 1 in 7, that is a very big gap. When you start to recognize which areas of life follow these so-called fat-tailed patterns, you stop optimizing for the average case. You start building in redundancy, optionality, and resilience. You prepare for the highly unlikely but inevitable extreme outcomes. You stop being surprised when the improbable happens, because you've internalized that improbable things happen all the time in the worlds with fat tails. You scroll through Instagram and see 12 perfect lives, but you're looking at 12 people's best moments from the last 8 months, not 12 typical day in a life. Every time you scroll through social media, Instagram, Twitter, a new reel, whatever, you're seeing what looks like a record of normal life. Beautiful mornings with light streaming through the window just so, dream jobs announced with these careful, humble captions, homes that look like they've never been messy, bodies that seem effortless, relationships without visible friction. And your mind does this thing where it treats these images like data. It assumes this must be what others' lives actually look like day to day. And then quietly, almost without noticing, you start measuring your own ordinary Tuesday against someone else's once in 24 years highlight reel. But here's what's actually happening. You're sampling exclusively from the extreme tail end of how life actually looks. You're seeing the top 1% of the moments, carefully selected, often edited, or filtered just so, always curated. You're looking at outliers and mistaking them for the average. It's like if you try to understand retirement lifestyle by only surveying old people at a luxury car dealership. Your data would be completely skewed, giving you a wildly inaccurate picture of a typical retiree. Myself, about a mid-work-life timeline, I went through a period a few months ago where I felt like everyone else had figured something out that I was missing. Everyone's work looked more polished. Everyone's life looked more together. Everyone seemed to be having these profound experiences at closed-door industry conferences while I was just getting through the week of deadlines. And it took me longer than it should have to realize. I was comparing my internal experience, the messy, uncertain, often mundane reality of my actual life, with everyone else's external performance. When we normalize the exceptional, we end up chronically disappointed with the ordinary, even though the ordinary is where life actually unfolds, for all of us. The real moments happen in that 99% that never gets posted. The quiet mornings, the boring commutes, the arguments that get resolved without drama, or never. The small accomplishments to be proud of that don't photograph well. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying there's something wrong with beauty or aspiration, but it genuinely helps to remember what you're looking at. These aren't random samples from the full spectrum of human experience. They're carefully curated outliers designed to maximize engagement and awe factor. And when you stop judging your life against these distortions, something shifts. This odd calm settles in. You can finally see your own life clearly instead of through this funhouse mirror that was specifically designed to make you feel inadequate, in order to sandwich ads between posts offering relief to the budding expectations gap for a price. So here's where I've landed after thinking about all this for a while. The world we move through isn't built on symmetry or fairness. It's built on these strange patterns, as if we're in a dystopian wonderland. Fat tails, power laws, compounding edges. where tiny wobbles snowball into enormous differences in outcomes. Reality bends in counterintuitive ways. It rewards tiny, barely perceptible consistencies and clubbers us with invisible traps. It shows us illusions and calls them averages. It combines risk in ways that multiply our exposure instead of dividing it. It creates extreme outcomes far more often than our intuition expects. We can't fix that. We can't make the world conform to our intuitions about how it should work. But we can see it, and that actually changes everything. Once you start seeing these patterns clearly, the illusions lose their grip. You stop chasing statistical ghosts. You stop mistaking busyness for meaningful progress. You stop believing that normal means safe, or that fairness is somehow baked into the mathematics of existence. You start understanding that 2 incomes can also mean twice the fragility, not twice the security. That the average describes almost nobody's real experience. That small percentages compound into life-altering differences. That extreme events happen far more often than you would normally expect. That everyone's life looks better than yours because you're only seeing their best moments. And instead of being paralyzed by this knowledge, you start living with a bit more curiosity, a bit more awareness, a bit more grace. You start building slack into your systems instead of optimizing them to the breaking point. You start noticing those small numbers that compound quietly in the background through feedback loops. You start calibrating your expectations to the actual shape of things, not the story that you've been told. You start preparing for the unlikely but inevitable instead of pretending it wouldn't happen. You start looking at medians and actual patterns instead of just mean and averages. You start understanding where you actually sit in the landscape rather than where you imagine you should be. You start living inside the world as it actually is. Beautiful, lopsided, asymmetrical, and completely workable once you learn to read its patterns. And that's not resignation. That's not pessimism or cynicism. That's freedom. Thank you very much.